Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Martin Drive Show. Welcome back to our continued coverage of the Russia and Ukraine war. Today, we're going to look a little bit into the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We hear a lot about the drone attack on Moscow, but there's a lot more going into it. As I've done some research, it seems that a lot of people think it's failing, but there are a lot of signs that with a little bit of help, it could succeed. So we're going to go ahead and get right on into the news and see where Ukraine stands on this counteroffensive.
Now we're going to head to Ukraine. It's been 2 months since Ukraine's forces launched their long-awaited counteroffensive aimed at pushing the invading Russian forces out of the areas they've seized. The UK, the US, other Western nations invested heavily in these efforts.
So, me not being too familiar with the counteroffensive as a whole, it doesn't seem that the counteroffensive means that they're going to be going into Moscow. It's their plan to take back their own land. So now that they've kind of solidified the front lines, they've kind of stood their ground, they can start pushing back the front lines and re-solidifying the Ukrainian border. It seems as though that might be a reason why cruise missiles might be in talks and why so many things are being given to Ukraine with such little hesitancy at this point, due to the signs that they have shown success in this war and that they aren't going to be walked over. In fact, they've pushed the Russians back and, like I said, created a boundary where they can hold their ground. So it's interesting for me to hear kind of the surrounding circumstances with the counteroffensive.
Donating billions of dollars of military equipment and training soldiers. So, 2 months on, how is Ukraine coping against the formidable Russian defences? Well, the BBC's security correspondent, Frank Gardner, has teamed up with the BBC Verify team to assess what progress is being made.
Right, so this is what the map looks like 18 months on after the full-scale Russian invasion last year. If it looks familiar, that's because it is. It really hasn't changed that much since last November, with the Russian-occupied areas shaded in red. Now, in order for Ukraine's counteroffensive to succeed, it needs to cut the Russian area in two.
Now, before we continue, I just posted a video, it's a lot longer than this one, discussing why that might be a bad idea to take the option to come down the middle and split them into two, because it could allow the Russian forces to almost pin them in, maybe cut off a lot of their soldiers and create heavy casualties for the Ukrainians. So I find it interesting that the BBC journalists seem that that's the best option. It'll be interesting to see at the end of the day what actually plays out. The strategy that we saw in the last video was actually coming down right above Crimea, going into Mariupol, and then working on taking Crimea. And from a basic map perspective, that seems to be more logical. It cuts off a lot of the Russian forces, and it kind of gives you a sole focus on where to go next, as to where splitting it in half is going to make you have to divert your forces, where Russia can kind of take this, quick ocean route and this little land bridge over into Crimea to quickly bring defenses to both sides still. So like I said, it'll be interesting to see which strategy they decide on.
Earlier this summer, in early June, south of the city, the town of Orikhiv, there was a battle. The Russian defensive lines are in black here. Let's have a zoom in and look. Here you can see the Russian defensive lines, heavily mined, interspersed trenches, artillery, bunkers. Very hard for Ukraine to get through all of that. This verified drone footage here shows what happened when a Ukrainian armored patrol ran into a minefield. Some of the close-up stuff is frankly too graphic to show. But the point is that these minefields and Russian defenses are so heavy, they're so intense, that it makes it very slow going for the Ukrainians to advance southwards. And the Russians have been...
Minefields, I don't know how common of a strategy it is, but it seems to be smart. As he said, it keeps the Ukrainian forces slowly moving forward. That could, although, be a reason why the sole reason why the Ukrainian forces are moving forward slowly, meaning that the actual physical Russian defenses, as far as infantry and other things, might not be as successful. So it'll be interesting to see if the mines are adding on to the Russian defense or are the key factor to the Russian defense? Because in time, I think they'll get through the minefields. It seems more like a stalling factor than a permanent solution.
And quite innovative in some of the things they've done. So this, for example, is their TM62 anti-tank mine. Now, some of Ukraine's armor will withstand a strike by one of these, but not by two. So what do the Russians do? They're putting two of them, one on top of another, to blow up through the hull of an Ukrainian armored vehicle. And this footage here shows a whole bunch of these Russian anti-tank mines that have disabled a Western supplied tank. Another weapon that the Russians are using very effectively is the Alligator, the Ka-52 attack helicopter. So given all these factors, how successful could this counteroffensive actually be?
The Ukrainian forces wanted to retake all the occupied territories, including Crimea. I do not think that that will happen anytime soon.
What Ukraine does have in its favor.
I don't think it's about what happens soon, regardless. I mean, we're 18 months into the war. As I said before, it seems Ukraine has created a boundary line where Russia's not going past that. Especially considering they're considering a counteroffensive, I would pretty likely assume that Russia's not making heavy advancements. In fact, again, in the last video we watched, we saw the front line map where all across the front lines, Ukraine is making slow progress. So while, it might not be next month Ukraine pushes through all this territory, the question really is, will Ukraine actually get their territory back? I think the timeline is less relevant at this point. I mean, with minefields, as they showed the attack helicopters. I mean, Russia's defended there. There's a reason that that barrier's been created. The question just is, can they keep slowly chipping away at the paint and slowly regaining their territory? Not if it's going to happen in a month.
Favor, though, is some very powerful Western-supplied weaponry, such as, for example, the Storm Shadow long-range missile, British supplied. And these are allowing Ukraine to hit distant targets, trying to undermine Russia's defenses from within. But the problem here is that all of this takes time, and that's a luxury Ukraine doesn't have. Within 3 months, the rainy season will have arrived, turning a lot of the roads into mud, making it difficult for Ukraine to advance. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
So they kind of explained why the time frame could be a bit of an issue with rainy season coming and, tough to traverse muddy waters. However, with that season coming, if you're looking at a long-term time frame, you could see them using the, Shadow cruise missiles from Britain, and if they potentially get the American cruise missiles, to start that chipping away at the paint over the rainy season where Russia can't really move themselves. It affects both sides. So if their defenses get somewhat stuck between, recon drones, drone warfare, between, satellite imagery, air support, and then the cruise missiles, you may see a lot of actual progress happen without actual, borders being moved. So it's not that the counteroffensive fails, I don't believe, but I'm, again, not a military expert, so I could be wrong. Maybe the rain just completely stops their time frame, but that just doesn't seem to be a logical conclusion to me. But the defense expert disagrees, and I would like to, give her the authority before myself here.
And earlier I spoke to Mick Bryan, retired Major General in the Australian Army and an adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies.
Well, so far the Ukrainians are making progress. It's slow and grinding progress, but we should also remember that this is not one offensive in the south. This is a series of campaigns in the south and in the east where it's making more progress around Bakhmut. It's running a defensive campaign further north in Luhansk against a Russian offensive, and it's also defending its skies as well as conducting a naval offensive in the Black Sea. So overall, the Ukrainians are doing okay, but this is going to take time, and we should be very careful about assigning fake timelines to something that's deadly and time-consuming.
Be wary of timelines, but what about the idea of dominance in the air power? And I remember speaking to Ukrainian officials in the lead up to the counteroffensive, and it was very clear that they felt they just didn't have time to wait for that, however much they would have wanted it. Leaving aside the kind of that decision, give us a flavour of how critical, how important superiority in the air could be.
Well, it's not a wonder weapon and not a silver bullet, but it is important if you want to prevent your ground forces from being attacked. And clearly there are some challenges with that, as the previous report noted, with the Ka-52 attack helicopters. But at the end of the day, no campaign is conducted at the perfect time. There's no perfect preparation, and the timing is a combination of politics and military preparedness. This campaign will go through till the muddy season, and then we need to be prepared for further campaigns in 2024 and beyond.
Well,
I think that's a very logical statement. I think that gentleman is right on the money. We got to be careful about saying Ukraine has failed because it's all of a sudden the muddy season. This war's been going on for 18 months. 3 months doesn't all of a sudden change it. I know that's a very journalism-esque thing to do, try to get the headline, try to, push the narrative. However, the reality really is, as that gentleman said, to just watch and see what happens. We're going to go into the muddy season. It'll probably slow down a bit. And then after the muddy season, it's probably going to pick back up. I mean, downtime is always dangerous. It gives your enemy time to think. That's why you still have to do certain things. However, this is two sides playing the same game with the same amount of time, and it's not over just because a couple of months in, it's not a landslide to Ukraine's way, just like it wasn't over when Russia didn't automatically roll over Ukraine. There's a lot of war to be fought and a lot to still see. So I appreciate this gentleman's 2 cents.
Let's focus for a second on the weather. Talk us through, as we head into the months ahead now, what difference it makes, how it changes strategy and capabilities.
Well, at the moment, you're seeing reasonably dry weather. You're seeing a lot of growth and undergrowth, which is hiding minefields, and it does make things more difficult on the ground if you're breaching through minefields. As we get towards the winter months with rains, that makes cross-country mobility difficult. It makes logistics even more difficult. So we really need to think about, how do we support Ukraine now? How do we support them across the winter months and then into 2024 as well?
I think that gives a pretty well-rounded insight into the counteroffensive. We're 2 months in here. As we saw in the last video, we've seen progress. The southern border being the least amount of progress, mostly because that's probably the most heavily defended border. Trying to support Crimea, which is Russia's first attack they had. They're not really looking to lose that, I'm sure. So we've seen progress all along the rest of the front lines, and although it's slow, progress is progress. And if they reestablish the border lines heading into the muddy season with a little bit more land controlled all around the region, that's a victory in my eyes for Ukraine. Then we'll see what happens through the muddy season, and we'll see what happens going on through that. But I again agree, the main key point here is, let's not assign fake timelines, let's not make assumptions, let's just report what's happening, and whatever happens, it's our job to report and see, and we can react as it happens, but let's not assume anything until it happens.